This was officially recorded and never fully explained. In the capital of the United States, the very center of military and political power, unknown objects were detected on military radar, violating restricted airspace, directly over the White House and the Capitol. Fighter jets were scrambled. Air traffic controllers panicked. Phone lines flooded. And just hours later, the targets vanished. This was not rumor. This was not civilian aircraft. This was not a single technical error. It was July 1952, and what would later be known as the Washington, D.C. UFO incidents became the most serious air defense alert in U.S. history during peacetime. On that night, and again 1 week later, something flew over Washington without authorization, without identification, and without any explanation that still holds up today. Satellite antenna, Air Force radar operators. Airplane experienced military pilots. Telephone receiver civilian and military controllers. Newspaper nationwide headlines. Everyone saw it. Everyone recorded it. And yet officially, nothing happened. The government claimed the objects were atmospheric anomalies. Radar operators disagreed. Pilots disagreed. And the data did not behave like natural phenomena. Why did the objects change direction instantly? Why did they accelerate beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft of the time? And why did they appear directly above the most sensitive buildings in the country? This case triggered the largest press conference in U.S. Air Force history at the time, a dramatic tightening of secrecy around UFO reports, and a permanent shift in how the government would handle the subject for the next 70 years. Pushpin, what you are about to hear is not a modern theory. It is documented history. It is official record. It is a case that was never fully resolved. And the question that remains is simple and disturbing. Back-end index pointing right, if this was not a threat, why mobilize the full air defense of the nation's capital? Before we continue, one thing must be clear. This documentary will not tell you what to believe. It will show you what happened, what was recorded, and what was quietly left out. If you want to follow investigations that never make it into textbooks or official briefings, leave this comment below. I want the facts. That helps keep this kind of work alive. To understand why the events of July 1952 were treated with such urgency, and later, such caution, we need to understand the world Washington was living in at that exact moment. The United States in 1952 was a nation on edge. The Cold War was no longer theoretical. It was active, tense, and dangerous. The Korean War was underway. Nuclear weapons had already been used once in history, and intelligence agencies were operating under the constant assumption that the next surprise attack could come without warning. Washington, D.C. was not just a city. It was a symbolic and strategic target. Every radar blip mattered. Every unidentified aircraft was treated as a potential act of war. At this time, radar technology was still relatively new, but it had already proven its value during World War II. Radar operators were trained to distinguish between weather formations, commercial aircraft, military traffic, and false returns. By 1952, experienced operators knew when something did not behave normally. And that is where the metaphor of this case begins to take shape. This incident is like a classified file with missing pages. The cover exists. The timestamps exist. The signatures exist. But when you turn the pages, crucial sections are either redacted, rewritten, or missing entirely. Let's look at the broader environment. Earlier that same year, UFO sightings had increased dramatically across the United States. So much so that the U.S. Air Force had already launched Project Blue Book, an official program tasked with investigating unidentified flying objects. Publicly, the goal was transparency. Privately, the concern was panic. Internal memos from the era show that officials feared not the objects themselves, but what mass hysteria could do to national security. If radar systems were overwhelmed by false alarms, if civilians flooded phone lines, if military responses were triggered unnecessarily, that vulnerability could be exploited by an enemy nation. Now place that context over Washington in July. On the nights in question, radar operators at Washington National Airport, Andrews Air Force Base, began detecting multiple unknown targets. Not one, not two, but several objects appearing, disappearing, and reappearing, sometimes simultaneously on different radar systems. This immediately ruled out a single faulty screen. Then came the most troubling detail for controllers. The objects did not move like aircraft. They would hover, accelerate suddenly, change direction at sharp angles, stop completely, then resume motion. In 1952, no known aircraft, American or foreign, could do this. At this point, standard protocol demanded escalation. And escalation is exactly what happened. But here's where the file begins to lose pages. Official explanations would later describe these events as temperature inversions, a rare atmospheric condition that can cause radar to display false targets. Yet many of the very radar operators who witnessed the incident rejected this explanation outright. Why? Because temperature inversions do not produce consistent, trackable targets, do not appear simultaneously on multiple independent radar systems, do not respond to interceptor aircraft. And yet, when jets were scrambled, the targets disappeared, only to reappear after the jets withdrew. This behavior did not resemble weather. It resembled awareness. And that realization quietly changed the tone of the entire incident. Publicly, officials needed calm. Privately, they needed answers. What followed would shape how the U.S. government handled UFO reports for decades, shifting from open acknowledgement to controlled messaging. The file was not closed. It was edited, and the missing pages begin exactly where the questions become most uncomfortable. Before we move deeper into what happened over Washington, before we examine the witnesses, the radar data, and the official responses, something needs to be said clearly. Cases like this don't survive by accident. They survive because people keep asking questions. For decades, incidents like the one in July 1952 were pushed aside, minimized, or quietly archived. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were uncomfortable. They challenged assumptions about airspace security, technological superiority, and control. This documentary exists for one reason only: to examine what is known, what was officially stated, and what remains unexplained, without sensationalism and without dismissal. If you're watching this, you're already doing something most people never do. You're choosing to look at the record. So if you want to continue following investigations into historical UFO cases backed by official documentation, incidents involving military radar and trained witnesses, events that governments acknowledged and then quietly moved past, then this is your invitation. Consider subscribing to this channel. Not for speculation, not for fantasy, but for careful, methodical analysis of real historical cases that still raise unanswered questions today. Because the truth in cases like this doesn't disappear. It waits. And what comes next in this investigation is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. The next step is to hear directly from the people who were there. When an event is extraordinary, the credibility of the witnesses matters. In the case of the 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO incidents, the witnesses were not casual observers. They were not civilians pointing at the sky. They were trained professionals, people whose careers depended on accuracy, discipline, and restraint. The first reports came from radar operators at Washington National Airport. These operators were accustomed to crowded airspace. Washington was, and remains, one of the most tightly controlled flight zones in the world. They monitored commercial traffic, military flights, and weather patterns daily. So when multiple unknown targets appeared on their screens on the night of July 19th, 1952, they immediately recognized that something was wrong. The blips were clear. They were consistent. And they were behaving in ways the operators had never seen before. As the objects moved across the radar scope, operators tracked them performing sudden stops, rapid accelerations, and sharp turns. These movements were not random noise. They were coherent, trackable paths. Concerned, the controllers contacted Andrews Air Force Base. Within minutes, radar operators at Andrews confirmed the same targets on their own independent systems. This detail is critical Two separate radar installations, using different equipment, were seeing the same unknown objects at the same time, in the same restricted airspace. At that point, the incident escalated from curiosity to potential threat. Military interceptors were scrambled. Pilots flying F-94 Starfire jets, some of the most advanced interceptors available at the time, were directed toward the unknown targets. One of those pilots later reported that as he approached the area, his radar locked onto a target. Moments later, the target vanished. On the ground, radar operators watched as the objects disappeared the moment interceptors arrived, only to reappear once the jets were low on fuel and forced to return to base. This pattern repeated itself. To the pilots, this behavior was unsettling. They were not chasing drifting weather anomalies. They were attempting to intercept something that seemed to anticipate their movements. Adding to the tension, air traffic controllers received multiple visual confirmations from civilian pilots flying in the area that night. These pilots described seeing bright lights, objects hovering, unusual movements inconsistent with aircraft. Some reported the lights pacing their planes before accelerating away. What makes these testimonies particularly compelling is their consistency. Radar operators described the same movements. Pilots described the same behavior. Independent systems confirmed the same data. And yet, when senior Air Force officials were briefed, the public explanation would later reduce all of this to a single phrase: atmospheric conditions. Privately, not all officials were convinced. Internal discussions acknowledged that temperature inversions could explain some radar anomalies, but not all, and certainly not the coordinated disappearance, and timing relative to interceptor aircraft. Several witnesses would later state that they felt pressured to downplay what they saw. Not to lie, but to simplify, to avoid questions that had no answers, to prevent public concern during an already volatile geopolitical moment. These were not hysterical reactions. They were controlled, measured responses from people trained to remain calm under pressure. Which raises a critical question. If the witnesses were reliable, if the instruments were functioning, if the airspace was restricted, then what exactly were they tracking over Washington? Imagine Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. The air is thick and heavy, the kind that settles over the city after sunset. Heat radiates from the pavement long after the sun has gone down. The monuments stand silent, illuminated against the dark sky. Most of the city is asleep, but inside control rooms, the night is just beginning. At Washington National Airport, radar scopes glow softly in the darkness. Operators sit forward in their chairs, eyes trained on sweeping green lines that rotate again and again across the screen. This airspace is familiar, predictable, routine, until it isn't. Shortly before midnight on July 19th, small, bright blips begin to appear near the outskirts of the radar screen. At first, they seem harmless, perhaps distant aircraft or atmospheric clutter. But then they stop. They don't fade. They don't drift. They hold position. An operator leans closer. He adjusts the gain. The blip sharpens. Then another appears. And another. Soon, multiple targets are visible, moving slowly, then accelerating, then stopping again. They drift toward the heart of the city, toward the Capitol, toward the White House. Phones begin to ring. Across the river at Andrews Air Force Base, radar operators confirm the same targets. Two independent stations. Same positions. Same movements. The room changes instantly. Conversations stop. Voices lower. Procedures shift from routine to alert. This airspace is not negotiable. Minutes later, orders are given. Two F-94 interceptor jets roar down the runway, engines screaming into the humid night. Their afterburners cut through the darkness as they climb toward the unknown targets. From the ground, radar operators watch the screens carefully. As the jets approach, something strange happens. The targets begin to fade. One by one, they vanish. The pilots report nothing visual. Their onboard radar briefly detects contacts and then loses them. Fuel levels drop. The jets are ordered back. And as soon as they turn away, the targets return. Not scattered, not chaotic, but in formation, reappearing in nearly the same locations as before. This cycle repeats through the night. Jets scramble. Targets disappear. Jets withdraw. Targets return. By early morning, exhaustion sets in. The objects slowly fade from radar, and the city wakes up unaware that anything unusual has occurred. But this was only the beginning. Exactly 1 week later, on July 26th, it happens again. This time, the response is faster. The tension is higher. More radar contacts. More jets. More witnesses. One pilot later describes seeing a bright light off his wing, pacing his aircraft before accelerating away at impossible speed. On the ground, operators struggle to make sense of what they are watching. These are not random returns. They behave with intention. The monuments below remain still. The city sleeps. And above it all, something moves freely through the most protected airspace on Earth. By morning, the incident is impossible to ignore. Newspapers will soon explode with headlines. Questions will reach the highest levels of government, and explanations will be demanded. But standing in those control rooms, in that moment, there is no explanation. Only observation, only uncertainty, and the unsettling realization that whatever was over Washington that night, it was not afraid. When the events over Washington finally became public, the discussion immediately shifted from what was seen to what could be proven. Evidence matters. In July 1952, the primary evidence was not photographs or video. It was radar data, flight logs, communication transcripts, and official military reports. And those records tell a story that is more complicated than the public explanation that followed. Let's start with radar. The objects detected over Washington were tracked on multiple radar systems, including those at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base. These were not experimental devices. They were standard, operational systems used daily to manage some of the busiest airspace in the country. Radar operators reported solid, consistent returns, targets that could be tracked over time, objects that maintained altitude and speed before changing direction. This is important because radar anomalies caused by weather, including temperature inversions, tend to be erratic, unreliable, and short-lived. Yet in this case, the targets persisted for hours, appeared simultaneously on separate systems, reacted in correlation with interceptor aircraft. That last point remains one of the most troubling aspects of the incident. When fighter jets were launched, the radar targets disappeared. When the jets returned to base, the targets reappeared. This pattern was documented. Next, there are the flight logs. Interceptor pilots recorded their missions, fuel usage, radar contacts, and visual observations. These logs confirm that interceptors were scrambled multiple times. Pilots attempted radar locks on unknown targets. Some onboard radar systems briefly detected objects before losing contact. No mechanical failures were reported that could explain the simultaneous loss of contact across multiple aircraft. Then there are the communication transcripts. Air traffic controllers and military personnel communicated continuously throughout the night. These conversations, later summarized in reports, show confusion, but not panic. Controllers did not treat the targets as imaginary. They treated them as real objects whose nature was unknown. Now comes the official explanation. Days after the incidents, the U.S. Air Force held the largest press conference in its history up to that point. At that briefing, officials attributed the radar sightings to temperature inversions, claiming that unusual atmospheric conditions caused false radar returns. To the public, this sounded reasonable. To many of the people who were actually watching the radar that night, it did not. Several operators later stated that they had seen temperature inversions before, and that this was different. Temperature inversions do not produce sharp, maneuvering targets, appear and disappear in response to interceptors, remain stable over sensitive locations. Yet despite these inconsistencies, the explanation was accepted publicly. Internally, however, the case was not fully dismissed. The incident was absorbed into Project Blue Book, where it was categorized as explained, despite significant unresolved elements. And this is where the evidence becomes incomplete. Original radar tapes were not preserved. Detailed raw data was not released. Some reports were summarized instead of published in full. Whether this was due to routine record-keeping practices or deliberate caution remains debated. But the result is the same. What we have is not a closed case. It is a case with missing data. And missing data leaves space, not for speculation, but for unanswered questions. Before we move on, there is one important thing to acknowledge. The evidence does not tell us what the objects were, but it does tell us something equally important. They were treated as real, and that alone makes the Washington incidents impossible to dismiss. If you believe investigations like this deserve careful attention, consider supporting this work with a like. It helps ensure that historical cases are examined thoroughly, not forgotten. Once the objects over Washington were gone, a different operation began. It did not involve radar screens or interceptor jets. It involved language, timing, and control of narrative. Within days of the second incident, the U.S. Air Force moved quickly to reassure the public. The press conference was not optional, it was necessary. Headlines across the country were already raising uncomfortable questions. Saucers swarm over Capitol. Air Force baffled by objects over Washington. These were not fringe publications. These were mainstream newspapers. At the press conference, officials emphasized calm. They spoke confidently. They presented the explanation of temperature inversions as settled science. But behind that confidence was urgency. Because the Washington incidents occurred at a time when public trust in air defense was critical. Admitting that unknown objects could freely enter restricted airspace would raise questions no government wanted to answer. So the narrative narrowed. Complexity was reduced to simplicity. Uncertainty was replaced with assurance. From that moment forward, the case was no longer treated as a mystery, but as a misunderstanding. Internally, however, the story was more cautious. Documents from Project Blue Book show that the Washington incidents were never comfortably resolved. They were filed as explained, but with annotations that acknowledged unusual radar behavior and credible witnesses. In the years that followed, a pattern emerged. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking publicly. Follow-up investigations were limited, and future UFO reports were handled with increasing skepticism, sometimes dismissal, regardless of evidence. Not because nothing happened, but because Washington had happened. The incident demonstrated how quickly a UFO case could escalate into a national concern, and that realization changed policy. The goal was no longer understanding. It was containment. Containment of panic. Containment of headlines. Containment of questions. This doesn't require a dramatic conspiracy. It requires something much simpler. Bureaucracy, risk management, and the belief that some uncertainties were better left unresolved. By the late 1950s, public UFO investigations became increasingly dismissive. And by 1969, Project Blue Book was officially closed with the claim that UFOs posed no threat and had no scientific value. But the Washington incidents remained an uncomfortable exception. They involved restricted airspace, multiple radar systems, military interceptors, and high-level attention. Too significant to ignore, too ambiguous to explain. So the story faded, not erased, just quietly moved aside. And that brings us to the most important part of this investigation. What still doesn't add up? If the Washington, D.C. incidents had a single, clean explanation, they would not still be discussed more than 70 years later. What keeps this case alive is not what we know, but what doesn't fit. Let's start with the official explanation. Temperature inversions are real. They can affect radar. They have caused false returns in the past. But when the Washington incidents are examined closely, the explanation begins to fracture. First contradiction, behavior. Radar returns caused by atmospheric conditions do not move in coordinated patterns, accelerate suddenly, stop, hover, and then resume motion. Yet the objects over Washington did all of these things. Second contradiction, confirmation. False radar targets usually appear on one system, not multiple independent systems simultaneously. In this case, Washington National Airport radar detected the objects. Andrews Air Force Base radar confirmed them. Interceptor aircraft radar briefly detected them as well. Independent confirmation reduces the likelihood of coincidence. Third contradiction: timing. The objects disappeared when interceptor jets approached and reappeared when the jets withdrew. This correlation is difficult to reconcile with weather phenomena. Weather does not react. Fourth contradiction: witness credibility. The people involved were experienced radar operators, military pilots trained to identify aircraft, air traffic controllers managing high-risk airspace. They had nothing to gain from exaggeration and much to lose from error. Yet their accounts remain consistent. Fifth contradiction: lack of preserved data. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case is what was not saved. Radar tapes were not archived. Raw data was not released. Some reports were summarized instead of published in full. In a case described as the most serious air defense alert of its time, this absence is striking. Finally, there is the contradiction of response. If the objects posed no threat, why scramble interceptors repeatedly? If the radar returns were clearly false, why continue tracking them for hours? And if the explanation was truly settled, why did the incident influence UFO policy so profoundly afterward? These contradictions do not prove extraterrestrial involvement. They do something else. They expose uncertainty. They show that, at minimum, the official explanation failed to address all aspects of the event. An unresolved uncertainty has a way of resurfacing, especially when it involves the skies above a nation's capital. Which leads us to the final question. Not what these objects were, but why this case still matters today. The significance of the Washington, D.C. UFO incidents did not end in 1952. In fact, their importance becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of what came later. Decades after the events, government attitudes toward unidentified aerial phenomena began to shift, slowly and often reluctantly. Documents were declassified, testimonies resurfaced, and patterns once dismissed began to look familiar. One of the most important confirmations comes from later declassified military and intelligence material. While no single document solves the Washington case, many acknowledge a reality that mirrors 1952. Unknown objects repeatedly violating controlled airspace, tracked by radar, and observed by trained personnel. From the Belgian UFO wave of the late 1980s, to the Iranian Air Force incident of 1976, to modern U.S. Navy encounters off the east and west coasts, the pattern repeats. Radar detection, visual confirmation, interceptor engagement, abrupt acceleration, sudden disappearance. In 1952, Washington was an early warning. At the time, technology was limited, data storage was poor, and public disclosure was tightly controlled. But the core elements of the incident, credible witnesses, multiple sensors, restricted airspace, are the same elements cited in modern cases. In recent years, U.S. government officials have publicly acknowledged that some encounters remain unidentified, not misidentified, not explained away, unidentified. That alone reframes Washington. What was once dismissed as atmospheric illusion now sits at the beginning of a timeline that extends into the present. There is also a psychological confirmation. The response to Washington shaped policy. It taught authorities that UFO incidents could trigger public concern. Media attention could escalate quickly. Ambiguity could be destabilizing. As a result, later cases were often managed quietly, internally, and with minimal public detail. This explains why Washington feels different. It happened before the rules were written, before messaging strategies were refined, before silence became standard procedure. In that sense, the Washington incidents were not an anomaly. They were a blueprint, a moment when the system reacted honestly before learning how to control the reaction. And that is why, even today, historians, investigators, and analysts return to July 1952. Not because it provides answers, but because it provides context. It shows us how institutions respond when faced with something they do not understand. And it reminds us that the absence of explanation is not the same as the absence of an event. In July of 1952, something happened over Washington, D.C. That much is not in dispute. Radar systems detected it. Military pilots were scrambled because of it. Air traffic controllers tracked it. And the highest levels of government responded to it. What remains in dispute is what it was. For more than 70 years, explanations have been offered and questioned. Atmospheric conditions, technical errors, misinterpretation. Some of these explanations address parts of the incident. None of them address all of it. And that is why the Washington, D.C. UFO incidents still matter. They remind us that history is not always neat, that official narratives are sometimes provisional, and that unanswered questions can persist long after the headlines fade. This documentary has not attempted to provide conclusions, only context, only records, only the sequence of events as they were documented at the time. Because the most responsible position in cases like this is not belief or disbelief. It is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that trained professionals encountered something they could not identify. Acknowledgement that the response was real. Acknowledgement that the explanation remains incomplete. The skies over Washington have been quiet since then. But the question raised in 1952 has never truly gone away. If unknown objects could enter the most protected airspace in the world and leave without explanation, what does that say about how much we really know and how much we still don't?